A crime, an injustice, and lost trust. Henry's life completely changes as he is released from prison. But with the past he left behind, the dangers that follow him, and a lawyer who is trying to reveal the truth, everything has to be reshaped. So what is the truth? And will Henry finally gain his freedom? Henry had just been released from prison, and from the very first minute of his freedom, he felt alone. He was so alone that no one had come for him. He already knew that. Henry had been a respected financial expert, working in a bank for years. But one day, without understanding why, he was arrested and thrown into prison. He was facing fraud charges, and allegedly, there was a lot of evidence in the case file. However, Henry had never seen those documents or the accusations, not even once. Without knowing whether he was truly guilty or not, no one believed him. Henry's father was an ex-soldier. He was a tough, strict man. To him, it didn't matter whether Henry was innocent. Just as he believed his son was guilty, he was ashamed of him. After the trial, during the 5 years Henry spent in prison, his father never contacted him once. At that time, Henry's wife also left him. The scandal was all over the newspapers back then. The money that had been deposited into the bank was gone, and everyone blamed Henry for it. After that day, he lost the trust of everyone around him, and there were plenty of people who hated him. While in prison, the criminals tortured Henry for years, trying to learn where he had hidden the money he was believed to have stolen. But Henry managed to survive. Now, as he was leaving prison, he was even surprised by that. But the worst part was becoming the target of the hate around him. He had no idea what was coming next. He didn't even know where to go. He had no money, and he didn't think he could find a job. The only person he trusted, the only person left behind, was his old friend James. On the first day of his freedom, he stepped out of the prison gate and started walking on the snow-covered streets. He was alone, but somehow the sound of the snow gave him some peace. When he came across a phone booth, he took out the paper with James's number written on it and started dialing. On the other end of the line, James's voice was heard. He was surprised when he heard Henry's voice, but he didn't turn his back on him. "Henry, is that you?" he asked, a bit scared. James was a little uneasy about hearing him after so long, but most importantly, he didn't want to turn his back on his old friend. James invited Henry to the bar where he worked. The bar was far away, but it seemed like Henry's only option. He started walking along the riverbank. The cold wind was cutting his skin, but his steps didn't slow down. The quiet moment by the river gave him some peace. At that moment he felt one step closer to being free. Everything was covered in snow, the current in the river was strong, and the surface of the water was sparkling. The bungalows, which had been placed along the river for vacation purposes, hadn't been fully affected by the snow yet. After taking a few steps, Henry paused between the bungalows. A family was having a barbecue in their garden. Their children were running around, and their laughter filled the air with joy. The father was cooking the meat, the mother was setting the table, and everyone was happy together. For a moment, Henry watched that family and was taken back to the peaceful days he had once dreamed of with his ex-wife. Back then, maybe on a summer day like this, he had imagined a similar moment in the garden of a bungalow. But now that life was far behind him. After he was imprisoned, his ex-wife had left him. All the dreams and hopes they had built together vanished in an instant. The pain inside him resurfaced. With these thoughts, he quickened his pace and continued walking. The distances between the bungalows were separated by fences for privacy. Each bungalow was placed a little farther apart from the others. The distance between them created a peaceful vacation atmosphere, where no one disturbed each other. As he passed in front of the other bungalow, he noticed that the atmosphere here was even quieter. The lights were on, but everything looked so calm. Just as Henry was about to pass, he heard children's voices from inside. 2 little kids rushed out of the bungalow. The kids were playing and their laughter echoed in the air. The children were running toward the river, but Henry immediately sensed that something was wrong. His anxiety grew. He started to walk quickly toward the kids. "Hey kids, you shouldn't get too close to the river," he shouted, but the kids didn't hear him. They were too caught up in their game, running and playing tag. Henry quickened his pace and shouted again. "Hey, stay away from the river." But the kids were still having fun and didn't pay any attention to Henry. As Henry saw the kids heading closer to the riverbank, his worry intensified. His heart began to race as he watched them get closer to the water. Then suddenly the little girl lost her balance. As Henry reached the riverbank, he saw the little girl fall into the water. The water was so cold that he immediately noticed the strong current behind her. The cold was unbearable and the fast-moving water was pulling her away. Without thinking for a second, Henry jumped into the water. He grabbed onto a tree branch to steady himself, preventing himself from being swept away by the current. As the little girl got closer, Henry grabbed her and, despite the strong current, managed to pull her out of the river. The girl was struggling, but Henry managed to pull her toward the riverbank. However, as he looked around, he couldn't see the other boy. A deep fear washed over him. He began shouting loudly, "Help! Help!" holding the little girl in his arms and looking around, but the other child was nowhere to be seen. In the background, the combination of snow and water, the strong current of the river, and Henry's fear. All these elements showed how critical and dangerous the situation was. Henry carefully checked the little girl in his arms. The child was freezing and in shock. She had her eyes closed, resting her head on Henry's chest. The fear inside him deepened, not just from the coldness of the child and the stiffness in her body, but also from the trauma she had experienced. Henry felt her trembling helplessly, and the fear in his heart grew even more. Without wasting a second, he ran toward the bungalows to get the child to a safer place. He left the back door slightly ajar and entered. "Help!" he shouted, panic evident in every word. Two women rushed out in fear. Their faces showed signs of sleeplessness. "What's going on?" one of them asked, her voice full of fear. "She fell into the river and was caught in the current," Henry said, breathless, holding the child tightly. One of the women noticed the little girl Henry was holding. Henry gently placed the girl on the ground. The child screamed, "Mom," and rushed to hug one of the women. In that moment, Henry felt a slight sense of relief, but panic and fear still lingered. The woman immediately examined the girl closely and quickly said, "We need to warm her up immediately." The other woman turned to Henry in a panic. "Where's Noah?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Henry tried to explain the anxiety he had felt while rescuing the children. "He was by the riverbank. I was far away, but I saved the girl from the current. When I left the water, the other child wasn't there. I'm so sorry." The women rushed outside immediately. Henry quickly circled the riverbank, shouting, "Noah!" But the little boy was still nowhere to be seen. Henry's eyes anxiously scanned the area. Meanwhile, the woman was searching in the opposite direction for her son. But the worst didn't happen. Noah emerged from behind the trees, crying. Henry found him, picked him up, and shouted loudly, "I found him." When the woman heard Henry's voice, her eyes filled with tears. In desperation, she embraced her son, and the tears flowed quickly. Holding her child's hands tightly, they took steps inside. The woman was crying, but she was also trying to calm her son. Afterward, the other woman, who had been changing the little girl Henry was carrying, worked hard to warm her up. As her eyes carefully followed the child, she was making sure she was okay. Henry, still affected by everything that had happened, took a moment to breathe, but the exhaustion inside him was now mixed with a small hope. They stayed in silence for a while. At that moment, everyone had different thoughts in their minds, but after all, the weight of what had just happened was still fresh. One of the women extended her hand gently and said, "I'm Harper." Then pointing to the other woman, she added, "This is Olivia. We can't thank you enough. It's been a tough week and we came here to rest. The doors were locked. I don't know how the kids got out, but if it weren't for you, you saved my daughter's life." Henry nodded slowly in understanding. "These things are beyond just a human duty. My name's Henry. Anyone would have done the same." Olivia looked at Henry more carefully and asked, "Are you on vacation here?" Henry, his words caught in his throat, could barely say, "Just no," then added, "I was passing through. Just walking. My teeth are chattering." Harper looked at Henry and said, "Oh my God, you came out of the river. You must be frozen. Let's get you some clothes right away." She and Olivia went towards the bedroom. After a while, Olivia returned with a hoodie and a pair of sweatpants, saying, "These should fit you," and handed the clothes to Henry. Henry thanked her and took the clothes, then changed in the small room Olivia had shown him. When he came out, Olivia and Harper seemed a little calmer. Harper gently said, "Please sit by the fireplace and warm up. Relax for a bit." While Henry warmed up for a few minutes, Harper brought him a cup of coffee. "Thank you so much again," Harper said sincerely. Henry looked at the coffee cup and said, "I should be the one thanking you for the coffee. I don't want to be a bother. I'll drink this and leave," he said, a bit embarrassed. Harper smiled gently. "No bother at all. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to us." She then continued, not taking her eyes off Henry, "Olivia's my sister. She's going through a divorce. I took the kids and brought them here to get her away from everything. Something like this would have been a disaster." Henry looked into Harper's eyes and said, "I'm really sorry about your sister." Harper smiled. "It'll pass. At first, it's really hard when a family breaks up, but then you get used to it. It's worse for the kids when couples stay together, hurting each other. Henry nodded in agreement. Harper, looking at him with a bit of suspicion, asked, "This place isn't close to the city. Where did you come from to walk here? There aren't any houses around, just bungalows." Henry didn't want to tell the truth. He stayed silent for a moment, took a deep breath and said, "I should go now." He handed the coffee cup back to Harper and quickly left the bungalow. The cold air felt heavy on Henry like a burden, but he had to keep moving. Henry arrived at James's bar, carrying a heavy sense of exhaustion. It felt as though his feet were carrying the weight of the last 5 years. James greeted him warmly and immediately gave him a hug. "Man, I'm so sorry for what happened to you," he said, tired but sincere. "Are you hungry? I've already ordered some food." Henry nodded yes, and then, following the smell of food coming from the kitchen, they went to sit at the bar. "Did you just get out today?" James asked, noticing the emptiness in Henry's eyes. Henry nodded, confused and drained, and said, "Yeah. I have nowhere to go." Seeing the gloomy expression on Henry's face, James said with concern, "Don't worry. I've already got a bed ready for you." Henry looked at James in surprise. "A bed?" he asked. James smiled. "Yeah, I became a partner in the bar and we bought the upper floor. I'm living there for now. I've got a bed ready for you too. You can stay with me until you figure things out," he said. Tears welled up in Henry's eyes, and as he felt an emotional moment, he quickly walked toward James and hugged him. "It was so hard, James," he whispered. James, noticing the tears in Henry's eyes, gently patted his back with understanding. "I know, man. Everything will pass. You'll be okay," he said, nodding slightly. Just then the food arrived and Henry's stomach, shaking from hunger for days, rumbled. He quickly began eating. But just as he was about to take another bite, the sounds from the TV caught his attention. The voice of the news anchor was heard. "Famous financier and major fraudster Henry Keller has been released from prison. Mr. Keller, who has never confessed to his crime, still faces backlash from the victims in his case. Countless bank customers who have still not received their money are demanding it back." Henry's eyes fixed on the photo of himself on the screen. In that moment his whole body tensed. Quietly and with difficulty he muttered, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." There was fragility and helplessness in his eyes. Right now it felt like he wanted to escape from the world and his past. But the guilt he felt on top of everything was suffocating him, and no matter how much he shouted, the truth wouldn't change. James handed Henry a beer to distract him. Without hesitation, Henry drank half of it in one go. The cold liquid helped ease his pain and gave him a moment of relief. But exhaustion still radiated from his eyes. The effects of all those years, the torture he had endured, and the loneliness had built up not just in his appearance but also deep within him. The bar was just beginning to get busier, but Henry could only notice the atmosphere for a brief moment. James looked at him and said, "You should rest. Let me show you where you can sleep. You can get some sleep." Henry squinted and looked at James, but the tiredness was still inside him. A moment later Henry took out his phone and showed it to James. "Do you have a charger for this?" he asked. James immediately handed him the charger and said, "Of course, here you go." Henry plugged in his phone, which hadn't been turned on in 5 years, and slowly headed toward the bed James had shown him. Everything felt blurry to him. He was so tired, both physically and mentally. The cold air outside and the snow were slowly draining him. There was a restlessness inside, but it was finally time to sleep. Although he had been so cold earlier, his body felt at ease now. As he lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his eyes grew heavy. Before falling asleep, as he rested his head on the pillow, he felt a mixture of fear and relief. A few seconds later, he closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. When Henry opened his eyes, he realized how strange the place he had woken up in was. For a few seconds, he kept his eyes closed to gather himself, waiting for the fog in his mind to clear. He opened his eyes, took a deep breath, and quietly got up from where he had woken up, heading toward the stairs to go down to the bar. However, just as he reached the top of the stairs, something he heard stopped him. James's voice was coming from a room at the back of the bar. Henry froze on the stair step because James was talking to someone on the phone. "Yeah, Henry's here." James's voice sounded nervous and cautious. "Man, I need to gain his trust first, then he'll tell me." Henry's heart began to race. What was happening? What James was saying didn't sound familiar at all. "Of course he's lying," James continued, his voice filled with obvious anger. "I think he came to me pretending to live like a rich man, not wanting to draw attention. When I find out where the money is, I'll call you." You'll take care of Henry, okay? Talk soon. Henry was shocked by what he had heard. Even James didn't believe him. Not only did he not believe him, but he was talking about getting rid of Henry for some non-existent money. In that moment, the person Henry had looked at with hope, the one he thought was sincere, was lying. The warmth he had wished for, the one person he trusted, was a complete illusion, shattered by the loneliness he felt. Henry froze for a moment, feeling like everything had collapsed in an instant. The safe space he had spent the night in was now completely destroyed and abandoned. The warmth, the sincerity, the help he had thought he had. It was all a lie. Henry jumped when the phone he hadn't heard from in 5 years rang. The unknown number on the screen of his phone caught his attention. However, in that moment he chose to ignore it. Thinking about the treacherous plan James had set up for him, the anger and disappointment building inside him, he tossed the phone into his pocket. He wasn't safe here. They had broken his trust so easily, so simply. Henry sighed deeply, quickly packed his bag and headed down to the bar. He acted as if nothing was wrong, trying his best to make everything feel normal, even though it was incredibly hard. James, seeing him, cheerfully said, "Man, did you rest? You've been asleep for hours." His voice still carried that old sincerity. Henry forced a smile, but inside there was an emptiness. "Yeah," he said, "thanks for everything, man. I have to go now. I need to meet someone, get a job." James looked a little more puzzled. "Okay, but isn't it still early? With everyone remembering your face from the news, is it really safe to go out?" Henry pulled himself together and replied, "Thanks for worrying, man, but I need the money," he said. There was still a hint of hurt in his eyes, but nothing showed on the outside. James smiled and pulled out a $100 bill from his pocket. "Hey, this might help," he said, handing over the money with a grin. "Don't leave without money," he added, as if he was doing Henry a favor. Henry was in shock. How could someone, especially a person who had called himself a friend for so many years, lie so effortlessly? Taking the money after James had already broken his trust shook Henry's world even more. He had fully understood James's true intentions. Behind all the warm, friendly behavior was just a game. He now saw how easily money was used. How had he not noticed this before? James's smile and the $100 bill turned everything upside down in Henry's mind. He now knew it was all a lie, but what hurt even more was that someone he had called a friend could deceive him so easily. Henry took the money and quickly left. He didn't know where to go, but he needed to get away from this place immediately. James wasn't alone in this. Henry was sure there were people after him. The only thought in his mind was that this place wasn't safe anymore. He had to leave right away. As he walked quickly, he decided to take out his phone and carelessly return the call from the unknown number. His mind kept repeating, "I hope it's not a threat call." The person who answered the phone spoke with a woman's voice. "Hello, this is Harper." Henry was shocked as he held the phone. Harper. He hadn't given her this number. How had she found it? He stared at the phone for a moment. His eyes widened. "Hello," Henry said hesitantly. Harper continued with a warm tone, "I recognized you from the news. I found your number. Will you meet with me?" Henry was on the verge of losing it, but he had to stay patient. "Okay," he simply said. Harper gave him the address of a cafe, and Henry, pulling up his hood, started walking outside, lowering his head slightly to avoid being recognized. The cafe was a quiet, isolated corner restaurant. When Henry arrived, Harper was sitting at a table in the far corner, dressed in a smart suit. When Henry approached, she smiled and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming," she said. Henry hesitantly shook her hand and asked, "Why did you want to see me?" Harper took a deep breath and, looking at Henry with trust in her eyes, said, "I know this might seem strange, but I believe you didn't do what they said in the news. If you tell me the whole truth, I can help you." Henry laughed to himself. Since the day he was locked up, he thought he had only shared the truth with everyone. "Harper, I've been locked in prison and I've only shared the truth with everyone," he said, slightly bitter. Harper shook her head and asked, "You're not out of prison yet, are you? Everyone knows you. No one will give you a job. You have enemies and you don't even know them. So how are you going to live? I'm a good lawyer in my known field. I've worked for elites, celebrities, and politicians. If I say I can help you, I can. I believe in you and I want to uncover the truth behind all this." Henry looked at her with suspicion. "Why do you want to help me?" he asked. Harper took a deep breath and then, looking at Henry with clear trust in her eyes, answered, "Because you saved my daughter's life. I saw it in your eyes. You're not the kind of person who would ruin or steal someone's life." Harper paused for a moment, then asked once more, "Will you let me help you or not?" Henry felt the weight of everything. This offer felt like a way out, but he had to accept it before it was too late. "Yes," he said, "I'll tell you everything." Harper took Henry to a luxurious apartment. "Only my staff and I know about this place. You'll be safe here," she said as she closed the door and invited Henry inside. The apartment was grand and modern, with every detail carefully thought out and a view of the city. "I host my important clients here. This is where we decide what to do," she added. "That's why it's kept extra secret, don't worry." Henry took a deep breath. His mind was still in turmoil, but he knew he had to trust Harper. Finally, he began telling her everything that had happened to him in order. "There are accusations against me. Documents I supposedly signed, documents I never signed but are claimed to be mine, everything else." Harper listened quietly, taking notes on everything. "Got it," she said finally. "We'll start with the senior executives at the bank from that time." A question arose in Henry's mind. "What for?" he asked. Harper smiled. "To make them uncomfortable until someone tells the truth," she said. "Please stay here during this process. Just to keep you safe." Henry nodded indifferently at her words and followed her instructions. As time passed, Henry started to feel safe here, but there was still a huge uncertainty in his mind. Almost a month had passed and they hadn't reached any conclusions. One day Harper came to the apartment with a serious look. Papers and documents were spread out on the table. Harper said, "If I didn't believe in you, I'd almost think you were the fraud." "This was a plan set up with great skill," she said, her eyes filled with determination. "Whoever is behind this, they're very skilled. But we're getting closer." Henry paused. "Has anyone gone through something like this before?" he asked. Harper took a deep breath and thought for a moment. "Not in banking but once there was an agency," she said, her eyes widening. "Oh my God," she said, "Alexander Becker. The bank's wealthiest customer, the one they claimed you stole from, an agency owner." Something similar happened within the agency. And he was a celebrity client of the agency. How didn't I see this? What if it's a client? Who would suspect one of the victims? Harper's eyes still sparkled with frustration. "But we discovered that Alexander was working with a huge hacker group. Maybe he got the bank hacked. I'll look into this." Henry was in shock, but he had to believe in the truth of what Harper was saying. The facts were emerging as they were pursued. Harper was right, and he felt that with this they could clear his name. A few weeks later, with police assistance and cybersecurity support, Harper uncovered the bank's operations. The supposed victim was actually guilty, and the real criminals were much deeper in the case. The resolution of the case involved courts, hearings, and media coverage. In the end, Henry was exonerated, and he was in shock at the result. There were only a few people left in his life who had believed in him, but after all those years of accusations and injustice, it had finally come to an end. Harper had not only been his lawyer but the person who saved his life. As Harper and Henry walked out of the courthouse victorious, Henry was shocked by what he saw in front of him. His father and ex-wife were standing outside the courthouse. Henry quickened his pace and walked towards his father. As his father approached, he said, "Henry," his voice emotionless but firm. Henry responded with clear determination, "No, Dad." The certainty in his voice reflected the years of distance and hurt. "Never." The man's eyes filled with tears, but those tears seemed like a fleeting moment of weakness. He knew how deeply he had hurt Henry, but maybe he had never thought about how to make up for years of pain. Henry didn't say anything to his ex-wife. With just one look, she seemed as distant as a time lost by the river, fading from his view. Harper quickly approached Henry and they left together. Henry looked at Harper and explained that his father didn't believe in him, and his ex-wife had left him when things first started to go wrong. Harper showed her sympathy as she listened to Henry. "I'm sorry for all of this," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Henry thanked her with gratitude. It wasn't just a thank you, their bond went far beyond that. They had built trust and a genuine connection. This bond had evolved from the relationship between a lawyer and a client to something much deeper for both of them. Over time, Henry and Harper's relationship grew stronger and more certain. Their love slowly blossomed and became official. Henry, though he was still getting to know himself, was ready to spend his life with Harper, the person who had believed in him and always stood by his side. He dedicated himself to making her happy every day. Harper, as a supportive wife, truly became a part of Henry's life. Henry would never forgive his ex-wife, as he could never get past the betrayal in his life. But his father, despite the years of distance, had continued trying and had believed in him. Henry received compensation and started working at the stock exchange. His father came to see him every day, trying to adapt to his new life. One day Henry, appreciating his father's effort and looking at him with the old hurt still in his eyes, said, "I forgive you." His father bowed his head, tears in his eyes, but in that moment, something had changed. In the end, the three of them came together again, rebuilding their family. And Harper became a part of that family, the most precious person in Henry's life. Everyone had their own pain, their own past, but together they managed to rebuild something new. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more content. By turning on notifications, you'll be instantly notified about our new videos. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next story.